Everybody hear me okay? Yep. I'll make a start and just wait for a couple of months for other people just to join in. But I think I know that Richard has joined us tonight, and I'm hoping that uh, Kevin Henry will be joining us as well because of part of what we're doing tonight. So I think it would be good just in the meantime if I just do the Zoom, or sorry, the Google Earth again. Okay, everybody see that okay? Yeah, the map. Okay. So this will just want to orientate uh, Richard. So I'm going to zoom out. So where we are, we're in Belfast. Okay, this is Brown Square. And over here, we have the Lagan, Waterfront Hall, Belfast City Hall, and Brown Square. So tonight we're going to be covering the period after the formation of Northern Ireland and then the Second World War. Now, this is a difficult subject tonight because the closer we get to our own memories, the more personal and emotive it gets. So I make no bones about this. It's not going to be easy for some parts of this, but as per normal, is what I said. My good old college lecturer said that if you offend everybody equally in Ireland, you must be doing something right. But we're going to focus on the Second World War. I'm just going to take a round Brown Square. Because if you're a German bomber, Luftwaffe, coming in at about 10,000 feet, Belfast isn't that big a target. In fact, it's actually well situated. And World War II is what we're going to be covering tonight. But for the sake of Brown Square was very lucky during the Second World War. In fact, it done rather well in the Second World War. If you look at the vicinity of Brown Square, I'm just going to stop it there. So if you imagine the American servicemen were based here in Trinity, they were based here, which is just in North Street. So this is their sort of not so much a headquarters, but their staff officers would have been here. Their USO club was just down here. So within easy walking distance. And in Brown Square, you had 22 bars, drinking establishments, dance halls, clubs. So as an American serviceman, and I remember it was also the blackout, there was shelters that people used for everything apart from sheltering from bombs, from fornication to toiletcation, as my mother once said. And so Brown Square became known as the Oasis of Belfast. Now, this is where you came to get your black market goods for to have a good time, no matter what that good time is. And so Brown Square did very well out of it. And it sort of goes against the narrative, and we're going to challenge narratives again tonight, of the Blitz spirit. We all pull together and shared sacrifice, and that's easy buzzwords. But it was a bit different. It was certainly different after the Second World War, whenever people start to revise history. And that's what's happened and still happening today. But for Brown Square, it had two near misses. Well, one particular came over the top of Brown Square, and this here, just the Trinity Church main. So this is, we now know it as Unity, or then as Unity Walk. So this is the Catholic area where all the killings took place, Arnon Street, all those shootings in the 1920s. And here you have Percy Street. And both these, one has been almost completely forgotten about, and the other one has become part of folk memory. We all are in this together, and did Northern Ireland do brilliant in the Second World War? And God bless Winston Churchill. Well, I'm afraid that's what you're tuned in to listen to, that's not what's going to happen. So let's stop it for a moment. So welcome to everybody else. I think everybody is in, and I can see, Kevin. So welcome to Kevin. Kevin's joined us tonight. Quick word on Kevin. Kevin wrote this booklet, which I use as my mantra for socialism and what happened in the 1919 engineering strike, and also then the what you're about to hear tonight was the outdoor relief. So without further ado, I'm hoping this is going to work again. Okay, everybody see that okay? Yep.
Yeah.
So I'll just reduce it again. This was supposed to be the end of the talks, but I honestly feel to do it justice, and I hope you all feel the same way. I'm going to do 2 more further talks because I think it's what's required. Because the next one, whenever we finish tonight, it ends at World War II, and then we're in the 1950s, the 1960s, and we're almost at the run-up then to 1969. And I think that's a period of history that hasn't really been looked at. And it certainly had a big effect on Brown Square. And then you have the Troubles. And that's where we're going to end it. Well, we're going to end it in the very last riot in Belfast, which happened here at Brown Square in 2013. So it wasn't that long ago. So that's why I see 2 further sessions taking place. Okay. So I'll make a start. So we covered last week was the run-up and the formation of the Parliament at Northern Ireland. So James Craig, the guy Dunville Whiskey, became a Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in 1921, and he was automatically created a Viscount. He was Lord Craigavon. There were parliamentary elections held in May 1921, as we know, for example, that Philip Woods was able to be elected because it was being used as a PR system, proportional representation, which was supposed to be how elections were held in Northern Ireland. That was part of the deal. In those elections, also Unionists got 6, 40. Nationalist parties got 6 and Sinn Féin got 6. But effectively it meant that there was almost permanent Unionist control of Parliament right up until Parliament was prorogued and then stood down, 1972. The Northern Ireland Parliament was opened at Belfast City Hall, that Stormont, by George V in June 1921, and it was boycotted by nationalist parties. But it's significant that in his speech that he insisted in coming to Ireland. He had been advised by everybody not to come here. He was under threat. In his speech, he specifically asked that both parts of the island would then agree through parliamentary procedures to merge, to unite. So the idea of the King, I think it's hilarious that we're coming up the anniversary of the formation of Northern Ireland. There's all sorts of fireworks going to go off. And yet, whenever the King came here, it was his understanding that this was a temporary arrangement. And certainly the Border Commission that was supposed to meet to agree the border, to make it more, less sectarian, I think is the best way to put it. Everybody had expectations that eventually Northern Ireland would and couldn't survive. Unfortunately, the civil war in the south deflected the thoughts away from that, and eventually Northern Ireland had a chance to cement itself, which Craig very aptly done. You never underestimate James Craig. So these are the men that actually took part. Some of them are folk heroes. Some are monsters, want a better word. But certainly this guy here is Dawson Bates. Now, this council was supposed to represent all the people of the North, and to be absolutely sure here, in the South, it was not a great place for Protestants. So it's not just a one-sided affair, this, but certainly for Catholics in the North, remember, they had them entrapped in this state that they certainly didn't want. They thought that the state would fold within a matter of maybe a year, 2 years at most, but that didn't happen. But Dawson Bates, for example, and I'm quoting, this is Professor Gray up at Queen's, such a prejudice against Catholics that he made it clear to his permanent secretary that he did not want his most juvenile clerk or typist of a papist assigned for duty to his ministry. By 1923, he had lifted the ban on the RUC men being in the Orange Order. And the Orange Order was a very, very powerful organisation. It reached right in to the top and the bottom of societies, and no, it wasn't elected. So it was a very powerful organisation. there was a close relationship with the Orange Order and Unionist Party. For example, the Orange Order had seats on the Ulster Unionist Council that had influence over what Craig was doing at Stormont. And some of the guys in this, you have Craig there in the centre, but this guy on the left is Lord Londonderry, Viscount Vane Tempest Stewart. So he's going to play another part in our story, but he does play a part in Brown Square because he became the education minister in this first administration. And unlike the rest of them, he was extremely upper class. You know, he spoke, their main house was in Downshire in London. Their second house was Mount Stewart. So, you know, he had very upper class and a different view on politics. And he was made education minister for that, but he wasn't the last. The Ulster Unionist hegemony was dependent on continuity of internal and external threats. So, for example, the Republic of Ireland, there was the Free State, it was known then, organised a boycott of goods for the North, including banking. So banks were attacked, and the Northern Bank in the South was attacked. And really what that did was give the Unionist Party their enemy. And, you know, the reason why we need to have Northern Ireland, this is what the alternative is. But once they became absolutely secure, proportional representation was abolished for Stormont in 1928. And that's how Philip Woods ended up being pushed out of his seat, because it was then first past the post, which meant that then the areas could be gerrymandered. In other words, political boundaries, electoral boundaries could be changed to suit the Ulster Unionists and the Orange Order. Derry is a classic example, you know, 70 to 80% nationalist, and had a totally Unionist council and mayor. So that said it all. And it was that way, and, you know, right up until the 1970s. And my father's going to come into this tonight, you know, and my father didn't have a vote. And yet there he was, this absolute proud Orange man, you know, fourth generation Orange man. And he didn't have a vote. He only got a vote in council elections after the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement took a hand in things. So that's going to be covered more extensively next week. There was continuing Catholic Nationalist Party Sinn Féin seats contested until 25, and then after 1932. So there was a boycott there as well. So it really gave the Unionists a chance to mould the state the way they wanted. And to give you an idea just how deep that was, you know, Dawson Bates was the chairman of a local football team, Glentoran. So even in sport, you had this sinew running through it. But just to go back to Lord Londonderry and back to Brown Square. So on the right here, you have Brown Square School, which is the school I went to. You can see the church, which is still there today if you pass up Millfield. And down beneath here, you'll see two kids. And this is probably on or near the 12th of July, mainly because they're not wearing raincoats or water boots. But you can see the school in the background. So those kids would be down roughly just to their left would be Coaches Street, where the Catholic area, one of the last Catholic areas were. So education, if you remember back to the very start, segregated religious education happened first at Brown Square, but in 1824. Lord Londonderry, when he came, wanted to try, and he's seen the potential of shared education. He wanted a non-denominational system where the churches wouldn't have as great an influence. He didn't want to wipe all the influence out, but that's what he pushed for. And he had to resign over it simply because not so much the Protestant churches fought against him, but the Roman Catholic Church fought against him. And again, there was this suspicion, if you think back to the first lecture, of the enforcement of the King James, the Sixth Bible, rather than the Catholic Douay Bible. So Derry quickly resigned and he went back to what he was good at, which was being in the halls of power over in London. He's going to come back into your story in a moment. So the problem of disloyal, in other words, nationalist Catholic control of Western authorities, Derry, they were just suspended by the government. That was it. You know, you're not loyal, so we're just going to suspend you. But like perhaps I don't want to make a direct equation, but Liverpool today has been a staunchly Labour area. Uh, I know there may have been connotations or suspicions of or financial irregularities, but they're about to have commissioners put in to control the city, even though there hasn't been a Tory councillor there for 20 years. So it's something, so you imagine the same thing happened, only then there was no redress. As I said, the Local Government Act of 1922 abolished PR and it redraws those electoral boundaries, gerrymandering. So that was really the key to it. It restores Western County, the counties Fermanagh, Tyrone and Derry to the Ulster Unionists. British government, who was supposed to step in, didn't. And so at the end, what you had then was really a two-state solution in a one-state Northern Ireland. Because what you had then was everything was being slowly but surely segregated completely. We all know how Brown Square, by this stage, only had probably about 30 Catholic families because of the burnings out in the 1920s, and worse was to come. So what was in 1830s like? Well, the Wall Street crash happened. Uh, it it had an effect worldwide, but also there was a great slump in the linen industry. And believe it or not, one of the reasons why that industry slumped was because women's dress fashions had changed. The long crinoline skirts with millions of linen petticoats have went out of fashion. Skirts got shorter. There was no need for linen. There was no servants anymore for to do all the intensive work that linen needs to maintain it. And so there was a drop in linen manufacture. And so unemployment had reached 23% of linen workers. But the big important one was the shipyards. Between December 1931 and May 1934, there was no ships launched. And you can see, it ended up with 73% unemployment rate. And this, for me, I'm a shipyard man. So I used to work in this slip. That's the East Yard. Over here is Shorts. And you can see absolutely nothing. So these men who had, and women who had worked 60 hours, that we heard last week, after the war was over, the Perry tried to force them to keep on working 60 hours. But by the time of the 1930s, world trade had just simply nosedived. There's no real connotation to that today. We can think about 9/11 or COVID, but the devastation that this caused was something more severe, mainly because it had a real effect on across Northern Ireland, across Ireland, across the world. So how did it affect? So now I can start to bring in the characters of Brown Square. And again, this is where we're now going to butt into what becomes modern memory. So I interviewed this girl, and it was really the start of my journey when it came to, I discovered a story of Brown Square. And this girl is called Lizzie Cathcart Gray. So she was 100 when I interviewed her. She was delighted because she was a loyalist, as you can see. And she was a bit of a looker, was Lizzie, as you can see, even though she's working in the mill, you can see the bare feet. And it's a 12th because the decorations are up. But, she'd just got a telegram from the Queen. And what made me laugh the most was that she leaned over and she grabbed my arm and she says, and do you know what? She says, Lemons down south sent me €3,000. And what she'd got was a grant from the Taoiseach because she'd reached 100. I think it was €3,000, nearly certain. And the twinkle in her eye, when she realised she had monetary value instead of a card. So that was Lizzie. Lizzie was no dope. She had lost her brother on the Western Front. As we know, he had died not in the Battle of Somme, but in the Somme area. And what I discovered also that she had then lost her son. So you can see their latest victim was 37-year-old Protestant John Cathcart, a clerk of Highburn Gardens, that's Highfield. So two gunmen walked into a tire service in Gresham Street, picked him out and shot him in the back. I remember this guy. He was a really nice person. Why he was shot. And this is when we get further on into the course, when we get to the end here, I am not going to lay blame or apportion blame. I'm just going to tell it as it is. And we're going to try and find his grave, as we'll do for everyone that you're going to hear over the next 3 weeks. Because he's one of those people who's just a victim who disappears in the ether. There's no blue plaques, there's no murals, nothing. So I found, actually, when I was doing the research, I found, and you should say their son had been killed, but I didn't realize that was when and had happened. But we'll see if we can find where he currently is residing. So by the 1930s, 1932, the workers had enough. They really had enough. And this includes these hard shipyard men, loyalists, who expected to come home from the First World War and home fit for heroes and jobs for everybody. And that's not what happened. Now, the government did try a program of house building, but it nowhere met the needs of it, because, in my own opinion, was the government here was disjointed. It was brand new. These people were not exactly the sharpest tools in the box either, which we're going to come to later on. But really, by the 1932, things really come to a head. So on the evening, I think it was October the 3rd, yeah, 30,000 people marched to Custom House Square, where a mass meeting was held. Now, there were bands from both sides. There was Killie bands and there was Loyalist bands. They didn't have any songs that they could actually play for the crowd. There was the only songs they knew were sectarian songs. So the only one that they both knew was Yes, We Have No Bananas, which is the title of a book by Paddy Davlin. Hope you can all see that. Yeah. Which says it all. They had no shared communication apart from Yes, We Have No Bananas. Thomas Cairnduff, the famous shipyard poet, he summed it up in one of his stanzas. What have we done to you? What have we said that you should take from us our daily bread? People were starving. Even to get outdoor relief, to get the meager charity that there was, you had to work for it. And the board of guardians who were supposed to look after this made sure that it was a very political supplement that was handed out. So as you can imagine, a lot of people who would have been activists in the movement and the strikers would not have been accepted for the guardians. So next day, thousands marched to Belfast Workhouse, blocking the road. The following day, the same demonstration was stopped by police armoured cars, because remember, by now Dawson Bates was the head of the police, and he had the Special Powers Act, which was just, he could do what he wanted. There was not much control, and the United Kingdom government didn't want to know. So 114 strikers managed to sign themselves into the workhouse, where they refused to obey the orders and danced all night until the police came and arrested them the next day. But the following nights there was fierce rioting, and the mayor, who'll come into this later on, was forced to offer an increase in the relief by 50%. Now, when I was growing up, this was taboo, except for my mother. And one thing my mother always beat it into me, and I mean beat it into me, was this girl here, and she was known as Millie Coleman. So when she was asked about increasing the rates for the not just the strikers, but literally the kids, you can see them, they were on food supplements, soup kitchens were set up, and she famously said, there's no poverty under the sheets. Now that stuck in my mother's head until the day that she died, and so through all whatever happened in the 1960s and 70s, my mother always remembered that when the chips were down, there was no chips for the people in the Falls and the Shankill. I'm just being straight about this now. Now, occasionally this has came to the surface. Here you have the Shankill Bulletin from 1981, where you'll see there's police in force of Berlin Street, where several baton charges took place. Now, Berlin Street is very close to where he who cannot be named now has his headquarters. So this was the loyalist heartland, and yet they were striking, they were rallying against the police the same way they were rats on the Falls Road. On a personal level, there's this guy here. This man's called Walter Scott, and this was his personal testimony to me. There's a mural, and there's the painted. It's still there. It's in the Shankill Road. He died when he was 99. He never made it to 100. He was a tough old man. Was Walter? He worked in the shipyard until the disaster would happen with the Wall Street crash and the shipyard layoffs, and he then got a job in Murray's tobacco works there, just as you go over the Boyne Bridge at Sandy Road, and he stayed there till he retired. Very proud man, hard working, 6 days a week, 12-hour days. And this is his sort of way to testimony. But I when I read this, I noticed that they deliberately left out outdoor relief, because my Uncle Walter, that's my Uncle Walter, by the way. Sorry, I should have said that. My Uncle Walter Scott. He was one of the ones who marched to the workhouse and beat on the doors, as he said to me, with his bare hands to get in. He then came back and started ratting. But what always stuck in my mind was what he said to me, because they marched down the Shankill. He lived in Woodford Street, which is directly facing here, just a brown square, directly facing where the barracks was. So I joined the march when I got to Townsend Street, and the place was crawling with peelers. That's the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. I kept my cap pulled down, as I didn't want the peelers from Brown Square Barracks to see me. We marched straight up to the workhouse doors and banged on them. Now, the thing about this is his kids today will deny all knowledge that their father did this, because it was seen to be a Republican thing. Uncle Walter was proud of it. Like, I still remember on his deathbed telling me, grab my arm, like, son, we marched to the workhouse. But according to his kids today, he was actually going to a Linfield football match and got the two crowds mixed up. Now, anybody in their right minds will know there's a bit of difference between a crowd of riders coming down the Shankill Road and Linfield football coming down, or Linfield supporters. But that's how they were able to rationalise this, that their father wasn't this Republican who was, along with the rest of the people in the Falls Road, who fought the RUC. So this is how history has been rationalised by people to fit in with what they believe they should be, not actually what really happened. So this is soup kitchen. Basically, these are men standing in the queue waiting for you to work. This is some of the quotes. It costs 5 shillings a week to keep a dog in a home, and they give us 2 shillings for a child. Paddy Davlin once, in his book, Yes, We Have No Bananas, the Protestant churches urged the Board of Guardians to cut off these grants to parasites. Like, this is their own people, parasites. He thought the poor were being punished by God for some sort of sin they committed. And that was it was. And Paddy was a very firm trade unionist. He's also an IRA man, but we're going to come back to him in a wee moment. But this one here I thought was a lovely quote. Over 100 people were arrested that day, including William Close, who was brought to court and charged, and replied, "It's very unfair. I'm a loyalist." And in defence, it was claimed Mr. Joe Sloan was trying to get Close to sign for Charleville Football Club. This didn't wash it all with the court, and he was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment with hard labour. So that sort of matches up with my cousin's story about Walter trying to join the Linfield football team march, and he ended up in the middle of a riot. Uncle Walter didn't get arrested, by the way. He was also a tough, if you look at him. He's also very tough. By the way, that's me in his arms. So that's the house in Woodford Street. So I'm proud of Uncle Walter. Such was the pain. Widows were going to the Board of Guardians and being refused. And this quote always stuck. During the war, my husband made bombs. I wish that Jesus had one of them now. That was a woman at the actual assessment, we would call it now, but it was an interview. And whenever the riots did happen, you can see, because the Special Powers Act was in place, they were able to use all the means at the disposal of the RUC, who after all were set up as a paramilitary police force. So you had a paramilitary police force up against strikers and rioters. But what is fantastic is that this quote here, they're kicking the shit out of the peelers on the falls. Are you going to let them down? And they didn't. There was really the two sides, the two opposing sides that were educated together, lived apart. Educated apart, lived apart. Everything in society was driving them apart. when it came to that moment in time, that apex, they realised that, one man's bread is the same as another man's bread. There's not orange bread and green bread. And so they did, that's terrible. They did riot together. But so sometimes riots are good for the soul, and that was one of them. So what about these people? It actually ended whenever Samuel Baxter was shot dead. There was two people shot dead. John Gain was the other one. This is his funeral. Thousands upon thousands of people followed that coffin. And for the life of me, I can't find where he's buried. I tried the city cemetery, but it might be Carmoney. I don't know, but I'll see if I can chase that down. When it came, it was discussed in Stormont, that these people are starving. What are we going to do? And the Ulster Unionists, the only people who were opposing the Ulster Unionists then were independent unionists. One of them was this guy here. He's known as Tommy Henderson. Tommy Shankill Roadman, who started life as a banner painter. And the unionist benches then started to sing God Save the Queen. Now, I'll go back over that again. So in response to the riots that was happening, in response to people who were starving, Tommy Henderson asked them, what about the people? They started singing God Save the Queen, God Save the King. And as Tommy then sung back, God Save the People. So Tommy didn't have any truck. Also, new people came up. So Betty Sinclair, you can see here, it's a nice picture of her, who was a mill girl who became a union organizer, who was Protestant. I just have bringing notes up here. And believe it or not, and we'll come back to her, she actually got 5 years in prison because she put out a pamphlet that had a quote from the IRA in it in 1941. Now, there was a public subscription raised. You can imagine when this state is like this, Northern Ireland state, what it had become by 1941. There was no opposition, there was no challenge. The head of the police, you can see him on the left there, he became a baronet. That's Dawson Bates. They had feeds in all levels of society. So Betty Sinclair, she rocked the boat. So she was to get 5 years, but there was a public subscription raised who were able to engage a barrister, a QC, and it was reduced then to 5 months. I think she did 2 months in total. And she, when the Second World War came along, Betty's one of those people who was, first of all, watched by the Stormont government because she was a fervent communist and supporter of Russia. And then once Russia entered the war, they had to sort of backtrack on that one. So as we'll find out later on, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But the funeral itself was led by Tom Mann. And I'm nearly certain that Dawson Bates then served an exclusion order on Tom Mann after as he left the funeral cortege, where he had to leave Northern Ireland that day. That's the power that Dawson Bates, Craig, Stormont had. 1935, I'll go back to this slide first. So 1935, so just after these two groups, these separate sectarian groups or areas, after rioting together, 1935, the worst riots and killings and murders and shootings from 1921 happened. So just 2.5 years later. And so it was led by this guy as a really bad pitcher. He's just here. And that's Joseph Davison, and he was the Grand Master of the Orange Order. And what happened was there was real tension over 1935 in Northern Ireland, and Dawson Bates had banned all parades. So as you can see, by this stage, the Orange Order was so powerful that they challenged Dawson Bates. So you may be perfectly certain, declared Sir Joseph, that on the 12th of July, Orange men will be marching throughout Northern Ireland, and I shall be marching at their head in Belfast. Listen, and I do not acknowledge the right of any government, Northern Ireland or Imperial, to impose conditions as to the celebration of the glorious anniversary of the victory at the Boyne. Nor shall I acknowledge any authority to ban the celebrations, which have been continued for 140 years. It hadn't been. The Orange Order had been banned beforehand, if you remember rightly in one of our lectures. But by this stage, the Orange Order could literally challenge Dawson Bates, and Dawson Bates gave in. So the march went ahead on the 12th of July, and the speech, so Sir Joseph gave the speech at the field. I think it was Ballymonagh was the field there. And essentially it went along, it's time Protestant, how did the Unionists try to convince their own flock that it was actually all the fault of Republicans? Well, it was a case of, well, these Catholics are coming and taking our jobs. We've seen it before at Brown Square. It's time Protestant employers in Northern Ireland realised that whenever a Roman Catholic is brought in their employment, that means one Protestant vote less. I suggest the slogan should be Protestants employ Protestants. Now, this will come in next week. So what happened to Davison then? So in 1935, he was elected to the Senate of Northern Ireland, which was an unelected body. So this overseeing the bottom chamber, but they were completely unelected. Another Brown Square man was on it as well, by the way. He served as Deputy Speaker from 1936 to 37. In 1940, he was appointed to the Privy Council of Northern Ireland. He was Deputy Leader of the Senate and Parliamentary Secretary to the Department of the Prime Minister from 1941 till his death. So his reward for what he did was to become the establishment, and a well-paid establishment at that. What was the consequences? This is the consequences. So the riots took place. By then, the police were using, as you can see, they're using the Enfield Mark V's here, deadly weapons. This is York Street, but it also happened at Brown Square, as you probably guessed by now. This particular scene on the right, for anybody who lives in Belfast, this is North Street. So this is the White Bank at the bottom of North Street. And you can see the police going up to take on snipers, because by then there had been attacks on the Catholics in the York Street area. And so the IRA had weapons by then. Weapons were sort of hadn't gone away, So the days of just throwing stones had ended. And you can see that the British Army were then brought in, the police both sides. Now, this is significant for the end when we get to Brown Square, and the army arrives at Brown Square in 1869, because the army themselves, I've said this before, as an ex-soldier, that most soldiers are not brain surgeons. They'll do exactly what it says on the tin, and they certainly shot all sides when they arrived here in 1935. But it could have been so much different. So this is looking up. I think this is York Street, and this is looking up, I think probably down towards Upper Meadow Street. So it's estimated that between 30 and 40,000 Orangemen marched through the city on the 12th of July, accompanied by what Lord Craigavon, the Grand Master of County Down, Orangeman, and Prime Minister, described as the inspiriting sound of the orange flute and the big drum. So although the day, the 12th, was quiet, you can see here, for example, the soldiers are standing around having a smoke, as they do. It's the 12th because there's a bonfire left over from the 11th night, but that wasn't to stay that way, because once darkness came, then the snipers come out. So although the actual day of the 12th was relatively quiet, during the next week or so, sectarian bitterness erupted into York Street and also Brown Square. And this, the drivers used outbreaks of violence at the time of year. And the trams continued up and down the street, but with the passengers crouching on the floor to avoid the snipers on the rooftops. By the 21st of July, almost 2,000 people, mostly Catholic, had fled their homes after being forcibly evicted, often with their furniture burnt in the streets. Several Protestants and Catholics lost their lives, with 55 Protestants or Catholics and 28 Protestants seriously injured. And really, when the army deployed, you can see the tenders that were deployed then, and this is those machine guns that you had in the First World War. That's a British Vickers water-cooled machine gun with a range of anything up to 1.5 miles. So not something you want to use in a civilian situation. So how did the Unionists square that? Well, the best way to describe this is to meet Lady Bates. So this is Dawson Bates's wife. So after the riots, after 1935, she had to have something to say, because there was Protestants shot down as well by the British Army. So Lady Bates rose to a round of applause, and she said she liked to go to D Street as she felt at home amongst them, as they now have a hall of their own. and which can carry on the good work on behalf of unionism. As the recent outbreak of disorder in the city, she asked on behalf of her husband and those associated with him in the maintenance of law and order for their wholehearted support. They were passing through trying times, but they would surmount their difficulties and return to normality. It was with pleasure she now unfurled the flag, the Union flag, and also declared that hall open. So just to go down to the bottom here. So Sir Dawson had consolidated Ulster's position in the United Kingdom. Mr. David Clark, chairman of the polling area branch in Sacketting, said there are traitors and Lundies who wish to see the government done away with, but as long as they could find men like Lord Craigavon and Sir Dawson Bates to lead them, they need not fear any foe. So how did that play out in Brown Square? You know, it was the cementing of the Unionist hegemony. And this is St. Patrick's, Millfield, with the Patrick Pearse banner. So once again, both sides began to return to their normal modus operandi, you know, the normal sectarian battle lines, but some didn't. And then along came Hitler. So, and this is where this man comes in again. So you remember him, he's Lord Londonderry. So this is the guy who was the education minister and who left. And he opened secret negotiations with the Nazis. Now, before I go into this, in the Second World War, nobody is going to come out of this intact. Okay, and I mean of both political persuasions here. So you may have sharp intakes of breath here, but I'm afraid that's what this course is all about, sharp intakes of breath. So here you have the cousin of Winston Churchill, and he invited von Ribbentrop to fly in the Mount Stewart to Newton Ards Airport, his own private airport, where they played golf and went shooting. This is von Ribbentrop. You know, he was executed after the trials at Nuremberg, and you can see Germany's ambassador at large on holiday. Her Joachim von Ribbentrop, seen with his wife and the Marquis of Londonderry, a Croydon before leaving by air for Belfast, where he spent a Whitsun end with the Londonderry family. And so he was firmly a believer of appeasement, and that only, you know, this is his book. Significant that he has an English line with the Nazi swastika. Ourselves in Germany, the Marquis of Londonderry, you know, but south of the border, something very similar was happening as well. You know, here you have Casement Park, the international march between Ireland and Germany. You know, because both sides were, by thinking that Hitler, by appeasing Hitler or by using Hitler for their own ends, that they could progress either their own causes, or they could prevent Hitler from doing what we know he did. And this is, you know, this is the problem with history. We don't know what was in Lord Londonderry's head. We're judging him from our viewpoint. So you have to be very careful. We know what history told us, and we're going to come on to that in a moment. But as I say, the problem with history is that sometimes it can be manipulated by clever people for fools, and we're no fools. So what happened at Brown Square? This is the last march of the Orange Order in 1939. This is just passing up Shaftesbury Square because they've been told. So after Biding and Dawson and Sir Joseph saying that, you know, it's their absolute right, the march on the 12th, no matter what. When the war came along, I'm afraid that right was quickly pulled from underneath them. I know that this is true because that's my grandfather there. That's William Andrew Higgins. And that's my mother at the field in 1939. And that really is the sash her father wore. That's his hat and coat. He was renowned for his hat, by the way. He was known as James Cagney of Brown Square. You can see why. But I always loved this picture of my mother. Bear in mind that my mother actually gave secret recordings for RTE during the Troubles, you know, so one of those things. But Brown Square then. Well, this is an old man on the left called Louis West, and I'm sorry to say that Louis was a victim of COVID. He caught COVID, recovered, and then they put him in an old people's home where he caught it again and died last year. And I, for the first time in 10 years, I actually put my own British Army uniform on and give my soldiers farewell. Such of the respect I had for Louis. I wouldn't do it for most people. For Louis, I did it. And he's holding a picture of the women of Brown Square, and it was used by Brian Barton in his book. And Brian Barton was my lecturer at university. I spent a year studying total war under Brian in his book. If you want a definitive book on the Blitz in Belfast, that's Brian's revised work. And in there, you'll see a guy called Christy Grimes, which I'm guilty for. So these are the women celebrating the end of the Second World War. And I know, but this guy here was my foreman. He was, sorry, here, it's Geordie West. This is Louis's brother. That's his other brother. And that's his mother. Because if you remember back to this photograph, there she is there. Because that's Frances West, Louis's mother, beside Lizzie Cathcart Gray. So now you can see how the women of Brown Square start to appear in other things. You can see the joy in their faces, you know, and this is Ellen Ray. Apparently she had a UVF rifle in her backyard, heading down a drain. And whenever the Germans come over, she opened fire with a rifle. And look at that photograph. I would actually think that's quite possible. But there was people who served at Brown Square. This guy here. So this is our MLA. I don't think you're going to hear sound on this. You may or may not. No, you're not. I need to sort that out. I don't know what's wrong there. So what he's marking is the death of Charlie McCulloch. Charlie McCulloch was a senator for Northern Ireland. He was sat in the same Senate as Joseph Davison. But he was also a submariner, and he was on the Russian convoys as well. So brave man. So they named the hall up in the West Belfast Orange Hall after him. He was an Orange man all his life. So he didn't die in the war. This man did. This is Keenan, and he was killed at the Battle of Hong Kong, and he was killed on Christmas Day, 1941. His body's never been recovered, unfortunately. But his brother very kindly sent me photographs of this and his medals. And he was born and lived in Boyd Street, that same place where the Catholics have been burnt out in 1920, 21, 22. I'll say he died in a far off field. His body has never been recovered. It's somewhere underneath. The next time you see pictures of Hong Kong, this man died fighting for it. And also we'll have my own family memory here, because here you have the Chindits, which is Lord Wingate. They fought. They were really, really tough troops, and they fought in Burma behind enemy lines. It's a bit like the SAS, only they were more deadly. And this guy here is Johnny McQuaid. He became the MP, and he became the first DUP MP after Ian Paisley. So he became a stalwart of the DUP. He was involved in the initial DUP. You can see him on the Shankill Road. That's Harry West, who was the head of the Unionist the DUP at the time. And that's the same man, that's Johnny McQuaid, because he's my great uncle. That's my grandmother. That's my mother, that girl you've seen in the last photograph. And that's me. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to know. My memory's blanking me out in that one, thank God. So you can see how the Second World War is now starting to come into my memory. And then we come to what actually happened. So Belfast War preparations. In 1937, Northern Ireland was not included in the UK Air Raid Precautions Act, and only introduced a voluntary act in 1938. Remember, Northern Ireland had its own government and was supposed to pay its own way. Craig stated that Belfast would not be bombed, as it would hardly be possible to find, and tried with big success to get the UK government to pay for air raid precautions. In 1839, UK government had warned Northern Ireland government that Belfast was a target of the Luftwaffe due to its strategic importance. But as Brian Barton says, few steps were taken to be prepared for war. In 1939, September 1939, as war broke out, Tommy Henderson stated at Stormont, does the honourable member realise that fast enemy bombers can come to Belfast in 2.5 hours? And he was speaking to Edmund Warnock at the time, who was supposed to be in charge of preparations for war. So the government, Northern Ireland government, would not issue the Anderson shelters that were being issued over in the United Kingdom, the British mainland, as in Warnock's words, Belfast might escape attack. And incredibly, he said this, people wouldn't have enough time to reach shelters anyway. You know, it would only be a matter of minutes before it would be all over. This is a government minister saying this on the eve of World War II. And they had been warned that the German bombers could and would most probably reach Belfast. So when a debate was raised at Stormont, Craig very quietly conferred with his advisors and said, right, the less said about all this, the better. Because there was no opposition. Who was going to hold? Tommy Henderson tried to hold them account, and you can hear, what happened to Tommy. Dawson Bates objected to public scrutiny committee as he knew that the shelter programme, as bad as it was even far behind Britain. And Warnock himself resigned in May 1940, stating when a person became a member of the Northern Ireland government, he became a tenant for life. Nothing but death removes anybody. So you had people that were doing jobs that were way above what their actual abilities were, and no way could they be held to account. And this is Warnock in later years. And he's just about to enter the Unionist Party headquarters in Glengall Street. And we know it must be before 1972 because the IRA blew it to pieces then. So even then, he was still an influential member of the Ulster Unionist Party. So by 1939, Stormont had sent back all the searchlights that Northern Ireland had and 2/3 of all its heavy anti-aircraft guns. I'll let that one sink in. They had sent 2/3 of our anti-aircraft guns back to England. On the 6th of May 1940, the UK Home Office warned government that Belfast was a concentrated target. It was an unbelievable target for the Nazis. You had the aircraft factory, you had the shipyards, you had light engineering, you had tank manufacture, you had the docks, you had the electrical stations there, all within easy reach of the bombers, all at the top of a log that you couldn't miss. And if you look at this photograph, you can see how close these are Sterling bombers. And this road here is the Sydenham Road, still there today. The bridge is still there today. And you can see how easy it would have been, for a German attack to take them all out, which is essentially what happened. So the Nazis were getting target information already on a daily basis through irrigation through Dublin. They knew exactly what was happening in Belfast. Even today, Republic of Ireland, for example, terms World War II the emergency. But the upshot of it was, by June 1940, Belfast had 7 heavy anti-aircraft guns. And this is the reconnaissance that the Germans already had. They knew exactly where Harlan Wolf was. They had target folders on it. They had it designated. They had dropping points. You can see Conswater, Short and Harlan Wolf, Craftwork. You can see over here the target for the waterworks. Because one of the misconceptions about the Second World War is the Germans mistook the waterworks for Harlan Wolf. It's completely untrue. It was a deliberate plan. They knew that if they hit the waterworks, that it would reduce the water pressure all over Belfast, and that's what actually happened. So whenever they dropped incendiaries, the incendiaries then would be far more effective. So it was a deliberate plan. The problem was that whenever they hit the waterworks, they also hit what we now know as artillery, the artillery area, New Lodge. These streets were decimated. Carlisle Circus was decimated because they weren't that accurate. So whenever Warnock resigned, J.C. McDermott took over. I think Jerry's on here tonight. So J.C. McDermott was a prosecutor in Tom Williams. Whenever he was sentenced to death, he was a prosecutor. But he took over the air raid precautions in June 1940. He had seen what the Luftwaffe could do in London and wanted proper shelters for Belfast, for Northern Ireland. Children were evacuated on the 1st of July 1940. Only 1,000 out of 17,000 actually left the city. My mother was evacuated. She went to St. Johnson in the Free State. So that's a breach of the agreement of neutrality. But this was all stuff that the De Valera allowed this to happen because he wanted to protect Irish citizens. So my mother actually spent the first 6 months of the war in the Free State and then came back because it was bored. There was nothing happening, Nobody said don't come back or you're not allowed to come back. John Oliver, the historian, when it came to the building of shelters, they were put on a piecework basis. How cheaply can they be done? So they built them as cheaply as they possibly could. And he terms Belfast Corporation, who were responsible for this, as composed of men promoted far above their abilities. So the response of Belfast Corporation was not untypical. Although cajoled and offered generous financial assurances, it initially failed to take steps whatsoever. A lack of progress stemmed not just from the incompetence and irresponsibility of its members, but also from the shared conviction that civil defence was a waste of time, money and energy. It was in any case a function of central government. That's Brian Barton. So you had a unionist party in control of Belfast City Hall, the corporation, who were more concerned about, as they were in the outdoor relief rats, on the rates going up and the rate payers paying more. And so they tried to do World War II on the cheap. When children were evacuated, I'd love this photograph here because this girl in the background, her look at these unwashed, flea-ridden children, and this is some of the things that happened. People in the country didn't realise how bad things were in the working class areas of Belfast until the Blitz, until the kids were evacuated. I said, how can people in Belfast be living like this? You know, they're like animals. You know, they had to fumigate them before they let them in their houses. So the war had a secondary effect when people started to realise that, you know, there was no accountability here, that this type of thing post-war couldn't go on. And when it came to shelters, well, the shelter here, this is built where the Titanic Memorial stood, just outside the City Hall. This is looking down to Chester Street. There was a public toilets, and it was probably one of the very few underground toilets in Belfast. That was Belfast's disadvantage. Unlike at London, who had an underground, where it could house thousands upon thousands of citizens, Belfast didn't have that. So the government, the corporation stroke Northern Ireland government should have realised this. You know, it's not as if they didn't see it coming from a year out. They did build shelters, which I'm just going to bring this up. So this is the City Hall. So the shelter you see here is just here. So that's where the Titanic Memorial stood. And you can see they built these shelters. Now, these shelters were built with 2 brick, with a concrete roof poured. But the thing is that they were built to withstand £500 explosive charges. But the Northern Ireland government already knew, because there was already 2 mines had landed just outside outside Larne, that the Germans were using aerial Satan mines, which were £1,000. So these shelters could never withstand that, and yet they kept building them. The one on the right's in the Shankill Road, and it's a staged picture. You can see the shelter's lovely and clean. There's kids in there with their gas masks. And as my mother said, they were used for everything: fornication, toiletation, you name it. You know, apparently couldn't go in them at night for the sounds. So people didn't really respect the shelters, and you'll see why in a moment. And this is Brown Square. So this picture's taken of the British Army as it's marching down Brown Square in 1869. These people are going to come into our story next week. This is the Calderwoods. But as you can see, even in 1969, there was still a shelter down here. I remember it. And it was still standing. You can still see the shelter sign on the back of Melbourne Street. So what happened? So the Easter Tuesday raid, German High Command had designated Belfast a target with the code name ETAP. William Joyce, Lord Haw, who was incidentally an Irishman, had broadcast Easter eggs for Belfast. My mother listened into that with my grandmother, even though they weren't supposed to. And on Easter Tuesday, April 15th, the Ju-88, Junkers 88, slowly flew over Belfast. My mother and my grandmother were coming from Mays Market, and they watched the bomber fly up Royal Avenue. My mother said he was that low, they could see the pilot, one of the pilots. It was that low. So, and this is daylight. There was no one to challenge it. That night, between 150 to 160 bombers left bases in northern France and the Netherlands. Luftwaffe was bound for Belfast. Heinkel 111 Junker bombers, Junker Ju-88s and Dornier made up the main attacking force. It was led by KG 100, which were expert pathfinders. So this notion that it was a mistake is totally wrong. You know, they hit exactly what they wanted to hit. Around 200 tons of explosives, incendiary bombs, and parachute mines were used. First air raid sirens wheeled at 11:15. By this time, RAF Squadron 245 at Aldergrove was stood down in case they were shot down by friendly fire. And when you realise that they'd already sent all the searchlights back, and I think there was only 17 heavy aircraft weapons in Belfast by then, there was more chance of me winning the lottery than there was of hitting them by friendly fire. The Luftwaffe literally just lit up the whole area with flares. The only thing that, according to my mother, and according to some of the accounts, the only thing that saved Belfast was that this ship, HMS Furious, was in the shipyard being repaired. She opened fire with her guns, so much so that she actually broke her moorings and went across the lock, still firing. And incredibly, their captain was almost put on a charge by the Naval High Command for illegally using his guns. And that was what really, that, according to my mother, that's what actually stopped the Germans from having a clear run at very low levels. Because every time they tried it, the Furious opened up. What did that mean at Brown Square? So I'm hoping you're all starting to recognize Brown Square. There it is there, okay? There's the original Brown Square from 1780, enlarged to the next, and now it's enlarged again. So now you have St. Stephen's Church, you have the Presbyterian Church. Now, whenever I was with Brian, I did the calculations on where the two mines landed, what the airspeed and conditions were like, and also what the ARP wardens, and they were stationed here on top of this mill, and also here on Soho Foundry. So remember, the founder of Soho Foundry, he's buried up in, I'm starting to lose it here now. But there was two fire wardens on the top of Townsend Street Church, one of whom was my captain in the Boys Brigade. So they actually watched these mines drift over. And so what I did was trace the release points. This is where they landed. This is the street. This is Percy Street Shelter. And this is where I believe the release point was. So the German bomber would have seen a large industrial complex. The same goes here. There's another industrial complex. So the release point was about here, which was right over the top of Brown. So the Satan main drifted over Brown Square and landed here, which is Trinity Church. And that's the devastation that was caused at Trinity Church. 35 were killed there. There was 38 killed, I think, at Percy Street. But you can see that the area literally was just flattened. These mines weren't built to hit the ground, penetrate the ground, and do damage to the ground. They exploded on impact, and they were ex-German naval mines, so they weighed 1,000 kilos. So the blast damage was immense. So Brown Square was extremely lucky. But it wasn't just luck, because this is Percy Street. So the shelter stood here, just here. The church, that church is now St. Luke's. It was closed down about 5 years ago. It's now become part of Brown Square. And it's now combined with St. Stephen's in Brown Square. And such was the devastation in Percy Street. I think this is the king. I'm nearly certain it's the king or it's somebody. But they had to have an official visit, because the problem was that for the local people who had been told that the government was going to protect them, that the RAF was going to be there, that everything was good. After that blitz, my mother and my grandmother and most of the people in Brown Square ran to the hills. And that's where they stayed for over 3 weeks. So my mother slept just above Glencairn in hedgerows. They were called ditchers, because they had lost faith in the Northern Ireland government's protection of them. And one of the big reasons was whenever this happened. So this is the Percy Street shelter. This man was known as the Parachute Padre, William Johnson, from Townsend Street Presbyterian Church. He had been injured. He was a paratrooper. He had been injured, but he stayed commissioned during the war, and he was present the night of the Percy Street attack. So whenever he heard the bomb going off, he ran up Percy Street with two boys, one of whom was my BB captain, Mr. James Moore, sadly long gone. And this is what they found, because the shelters weren't built to withstand the Satan bombs. So essentially, in popular memory, the Nazis killed these people. And technically, yes, the Nazis did kill the people in Percy Street shelter. But what really happened was the bomb didn't actually hit Percy Street shelter. It landed a number of meters away. But because the shelter's walls weren't built to sustain it, it sucked the walls out and it dropped the concrete roof on top of the people inside. That's what killed them. And whenever Reverend Johnson got up there, he realised what had happened. And so he went down and he broke into a car repair place and stole a car jack. And you can see Jack's inserted. You can see it, but you can see the interior. You know, the main damage was done whenever people were actually sucked out. They were sucked out from the shelter, and this is where they were buried. Now, they were taken to Peters Hill Baths. There was no room. The amount that were killed that night, 800 crowd. It was the worst loss of life outside of London any one night. And it really did affect the psychology of people like my mother, who realised that the state didn't protect them. You know, there was no state there to do so. And remember, you know, my Uncle Johnny was away in Burma at the time. Certainly for William Johnson, the fact that he's going to play our partner story next week, because he did play a big part in trying and bring people back after the disasters that there was the Second World War. And Townsend Street Church itself was hit by a fireball. If you go there today and you go in and you look up in the third pew, you'll still see a leak because they've never been able to fix it all the way from 1941 to today. But when I say that everybody has something to look back, not with pride on, you know, there's no great blitz spirit here and we all done it together and we beat the Germans. It really wasn't that way. In fact, Northern Ireland just squeaked its way through more by good luck than guidance. But it also wasn't helped by what was going on. So, and this is, I'm going to bring my father and mother into it here, because now my father was a tobacco worker. So he was in like my Uncle Walter, he was in a protected employment. So he worked in Gallagher's. So he became a fire watcher, ARP, during the war. And this is my mother, and they're walking down Royal Avenue. So this is Castle Junction, just behind them. And you can see some of the war damage here. So according to my father, the only reason that Protestant areas were hit was because the Catholics had shone lights up in the sky to track the German bombers. Now, for anybody with hit or wit, you know, a German bomber at 10,000 feet is not going to, it's just an unbelievable bullshit to be straight. But the problem was that this is some of the things that were put out by those who've seen another opportunity, but it wasn't helped by the actions of the IRA. Now, this particular story, this story comes from Paddy Davlin. So you can see Paddy Davlin. I have great amount of time for Paddy Davlin, God rest his soul. There he is standing there. And you can see him with the SDLP, Eddie McGrady, John Curry, Jerry Fitt, John Hume, Evan Cooper. I can't remember his name. So Paddy was very influential, man. But Paddy claimed that the IRA helped its allies, the Germans, by supplying information on Belfast defences to Hermann Goetz, a German agent in Ireland, and that this may have been used by the Luftwaffe during the Easter Tuesday raid. MI5 records do indeed indicate that Goetz was in contact with members of the Republican movement prior to his arrest in November 1941. What is certain that before this, on the 20th of October 1942, G2, which is the Irish equivalent of MI5, seized a highly sensitive and revealing document that was found in the handbag of Helena Kelly, an IRA courier at a house in Rathmines, Dublin, by a member of the Garda Síochána, and is currently held among the Guts papers in the Irish military archives. It's 24 pages in length, typed in single space and entitled Comprehensive Military Report on Belfast, and was clearly intended for transmission to the German authorities, the Nazis. At its time of writing, to be the 1st of July 1941. So it was actually a report on how effective the German raid was in May. The bulk of the report dealt with British troops billeted in the Belfast area, and by implication, part of its objective would also been to encourage the Germans to consider invasion. Certainly, this would have been the main relevance and value of the material contained. It also reviewed the armaments held at various camps and military bases, and concluded they were well equipped with Brennan Lewis guns. The number of anti-tank weapons was poor, and there was no tanks in Belfast proper. which is not true. We had 6 tanks. They were protecting Stormont, which is no cracker aside. But this is actually the man himself. This is Herm Guts himself. He is buried now Glen Cree. I visited his grave, but he was working, and this is Stephen Hayes, who was the officer commandant of the IRA in the 1940s. So there was collusion there. Now you can hear say, Ireland's opportunity is England's difficulties are Ireland's opportunity, but it doesn't. For me, it doesn't wash, especially when it comes to what was known, and especially if you look, whenever he landed by parachute. He landed miles from nowhere. He walked 80 miles, and he just knew that there was one person he could go to as a safe house. This girl here, she's a Solda gone, so daughter of Maud gone. And he didn't trust her. In fact, he didn't trust the IRA at all. He thought they were penetrated completely by the Irish security services, which is probably true because he was picked up and interned shortly afterwards. And one of those ironies was that one of the most effective people operating against the IRA in the Second World War was Eamon de Valera. Once it was decided that the state itself was at risk, de Valera immediately moved, and the IRA were not disarmed, but they were certainly made not effective. But here comes the problem. What is memory, So here you have Sean Russell's statue. Russell died on a German U-boat on the way back to Ireland, buried under full German military colours. There's, as I said, I don't want to, and I know that I knew this was a statue until somebody beheaded it. And I know a new statue has been put up by the Irish National Graves. For me, put the statue up, but put the truth up. Put the truth up. Nobody's perfect. But I'll leave that to you. But we'll see when we get to Multi. But when it came to Guts, he actually got asylum in Ireland until something happened. We don't know what. It's still sealed. But he committed suicide by taking cyanide. But this is his funeral, and he's been buried under the swastika. People in the crowd had swastika armbands. That's 1947. It's not 1945. And that's, when it comes to Irish people in the Second World War, I know that Peter Fox is on tonight. And this is Peter's great uncle. Peter, I think it is, isn't it? You on there? Yep.
Yeah, it's my father's first cousin, Frank.
First cousin. So what was his name, Peter?
Patrick Fox.
Patrick Fox. So Patrick Fox was one of the first, when it comes to the Nazis and the potential of what happened and what could have happened if the Nazis had been brought into Ireland using the IRA as a back door. I studied it. I worked at Auschwitz for 3.5 years as a guide, and I also studied at Jagiellonian University. To the best of our knowledge, Irish people had still not been classified, but the English had. So English were classified as Aryan, a superior race. We were unclassified. So to the best of our knowledge, we were to be shipped out via Dublin and Belfast to work in forced labour camps as slaves in England. So that was to be our fate. But Irishmen fought all throughout the Second World War. And Mr. Fox here was one of the first in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camps and the devastation that was caused there. We know that Irishmen were there as well because the guy who set the makeup for him is this man here. And that's my Uncle Frank. That's Francis Higgins, can't remember his middle name. But he was an RAF operator all through the war. And he was also one of the first men in the Bergen-Belsen. And he was sent in there to set up the sound recording equipment for Richard Dimbleby. Hence, we know that Mr. Fox here, my Uncle Frank would have set this makeup for him, to put it mildly. Just one quick aside is whenever they did get into the camp, they had found, I think it was about 20 guards, Uncle Frank, SS guards. You knew them because, number one, they were fit and healthy, and they had a tattoo of a blood group on the inside of their left arm. So they round them up. They got themselves machine guns, and they're about to have summary justice whenever a British officer stepped in and said no, under no circumstances. And they said, well, look, the Americans are here. They've told us that's what they do. He says, well, that's what the Americans do, but that's not what British soldiers do. And so those SS guards, I don't know what happened to them. Chances are most of them just returned to normal. You know, this there's a popular misconception that all the SS were put on trial and jailed or hung or whatever. Not true. But my Uncle Frank regretted not using a machine gun that day to his damn day. So at Brown Square then, it was party time. The war was over. So this is a Sackville Street. So you can see the flag is there. So the Northern Ireland government had to find ways to try and mitigate what they had done. This is that big photograph of all the women at Brown Square. This is outside the City Hall. I love this one because you have an Arab, and I did discover who this person was. And his sister's still alive. She still lives down here. Ultra is pro-Israeli loyalist who, to this day, mortification, her brother dressed as an Arab, and she doesn't know why I did it. I think it's a class. Karma, as I say. So then all of a sudden, the Northern government had to find ways then to try and reconcile what had happened with what they wanted to appear to happen. And so they brought Eisenhower over and made him a free man of the city. But if you notice, so this particular photograph is it's not at Ballylumford, but certainly the welcoming party at Ballylumford, among that welcoming party was Sir Crawford McCullough, the Lord Mayor of Belfast, who was partly responsible for the shelters to go up, and Edmund Warnock, the guy who sent those guns and searchlights back. And there he was welcoming Eisenhower. And here you can see Eisenhower he stayed in Belfast, and again you can see McCullough beside him. And here you have Lord Londonderry. That's the guy who brought over Ribbentrop to negotiate peace with him. And so this is how history then started to be rewritten. And my people, whenever they talk about the Blitz and the Blitz spirit, and isn't it great? And Winston Churchill, how great a person he was. You know, Winston Churchill offered Northern Ireland to De Valera in return for the treaty ports. But again, that's something that is not well portrayed. When it came to my father, this is where the real problems do happen. You know, De Valera saying, whenever it was discovered that Hitler had committed suicide, De Valera signed the Book of Condolence on behalf of Douglas Hyde, the President of Ireland, at the death of Adolf Hitler, on behalf of all the people of Ireland. Now, for people like my mother and father, who had lived through the Blitz, that was the unforgivable sin. Like, that was it. You know, and the German legation in Dublin operated throughout the war. You know, there you have Dr. Ebert Hempel. So he was working on behalf of the Nazis. You have Adolf Marr. I think he became an official in the Free State education. And one of those, I'm hoping this is going to work. There's no sound on this. But in 1859, Otto Skorzeny, so one of the top SS generals, actually bought a ranch just outside Dublin and applied for Irish citizenship. But he lived there for a couple of years. Now, again, a lot of these files are sealed, and it was sealed until I'm pushing up daisies. But this was at a time that the SS were looking for passports to get out of Germany, to get to Argentina and South America. This is just my own belief, is that would have been an easy way to do it. And so all those Irishmen, you know, there was more Irishmen from the Irish Republic signed up to fight the Nazis than there was from Northern Ireland. You know, and that's something, if you go down to the Northern Ireland War Memorial, that's something they have there, because that's the forgotten history. What De Valera did that day, why he did it, we all know Dave was his own person. But what he did was he wiped out all the good things that happened. That all the men who died, and you know, I think this is the Boston Post in 1950, having to go to the people in America and say, look what the Irish did. You know, it wasn't just the British who won the Second World War. And this is one of the misconceptions, that Britain won the Second World War. Absolutely not. You know, it was the Americans and the Russians, mostly the Russians, I might add. Certainly if you go to Brand's lectures, he'll tell you that, you know, Britain was kicked out of Europe in 1940 and only came back when the Americans allowed them to go back in 1844. You know, by then the empire was gone. So there's no illusions with Brand's course. But these people were written out of history. You know, they were neutral, that they allowed U-boats to provision. And when we go to Milltown, one of the saddest things, and I'm going to finish with this tonight, is you discover stories that are so incredible, so unbelievable. Because this man here is called Christy Grimes, and Christy was a First World War Connaught Ranger. He joined up and he served. He was part of Boyle military barracks, served throughout the First World War. He joined up when he was 40. So this man, it was tough to go through basic training. Won decorations, you can see. Retired to Belfast with his wife, got a house, had 2 kids, and they lived in Beer Street, which is just at the back of where Cityside Stores is today. And lo and behold, the Easter raid, one bomb hit the mill there, the wall collapsed and flattened Beer Street. And sadly, Christy and his wife and his son, Christy Jr., were buried. Christy's body was found. His wife, we think half of her was buried in Milltown and the other half was buried in the city cemetery, because they couldn't identify bodies unless they had some sort of religious identification. And his mother had a crucifix, but she'd been blown in half. And so therefore, we think the legs were buried in the city cemetery plot, which we're going to visit. And Christy himself, as you can see, so he was buried alive. He was pronounced dead. He was given, the priest had already given the last rites. And it was only a surgeon passing, and it was the surgeon at the time was a guy called Hugh Flynn, the father of Earl Flynn, the famous movie star, who actually heard sounds coming from this pile of bodies and asked the priest to go and have a look. And lo and behold, they found Christy Grimes Jr. And Christy came on to be a famous, sorry, hang on, let's bring this to the front of a con. So he ran the Gaumont cinemas in Belfast, and you see him with the Carry On team. Then we watched the Carry On films. You know, so Christy, and he died only a couple of years ago. So to commemorate poor old Christy and all those men from the Irish divisions who have graves, his grave is intended. If you have a look, there's a British military grave beside him. Just see there. That's Christy's grave at Milltown. So that's the M1 behind. And this is a group of people. The Polish army was there. This is Relatives for Justice. There's a sister of a hunger striker there. That day we commemorated all the people who died in conflict in Milltown that day, from the Shankill bombing through to Christy Grimes, through to anyone who was killed. We didn't make any judgments on what people did, how they were killed, but I always felt sorry for Christy because he died in the Second World War. He should have a soldier's grave and be tended, you know, because people don't realise that Milltown is a British military cemetery. So every so often I nip up to Christy's grave and cut the grass and say hello. But we always put a flower down when we can. And in fairness to Irishmen, to Irish people, whenever I mentioned this to the Felons Association that this had happened, and asked, was it okay we were Connaught Rangers? This is British Army, you know, this is British Army Association coats. I asked would it be okay, and they said not only would it be okay, we will provide a paper to play a lament for all those who died in conflict. And so this is what you're seeing in this picture on the right. So we're going to visit this and we'll go to Milltown. But it's a measure of what happened, just a small part of what happened at Brown Square over those short, tumultuous years. And just for a bit of a laugh to finish off, this is a movie scene that I drove into by mistake with my son. I nearly died of the shock. It was about 7 or 8 years ago. I drove in from here, because I'm a taxi driver, I just ignore road signs. So I drove past it, drove in and drove up a street when we were doing this. So, but it could have been, that's Northern Wig behind at the back there, by the way. So that's tonight's lecture. Did everyone enjoy it? If you want to just unmute yourself. Hope it was as interesting as they normally are.
Thanks a lot, Frank.
I hope I offended everybody equally.
But you didn't try half hard enough.